Okay, let's talk about Genesis 1 and let's talk about our modern scientific worldview. We grew up with NASA images about our solar system, about planet Earth, and we are not aware how much we read into the Bible. If you open up your Bible and you start reading, and the first sentence says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." What picture does form in your mind when you think about "in the beginning, God created the earth"? You can try it for a moment. And I bet that for most of you, what you actually see is this. You see a globe. In the beginning, God created planet Earth. Because we know where Earth is located. We know it's in our solar system. We've learned that when we were small. Maybe you built models in school. Of course, this is not a right ratio. We've seen pictures from the Hubble telescope. We know about the Milky Way. We know that we are located exactly here. We have seen pictures of starry galaxies. And we grew up in this environment. This is something that we have, with the milk of our mother, we have taken that in, so to say. It's our cultural environment. It's the meanings that the words have gotten through the stories that we grew up with, the story of our solar system. So when we read "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth," we think about the little blue planet floating around in space. And so when we need to fill these words, we say, "Oh, in the beginning, God created the heavens." What could that be? Maybe the universe, space, outer space, and the earth. Now the question is this really what the author intended when he wrote this? Because since when do we have these pictures? I mean, this is one of the earliest pictures of Earth taken by NASA, and this is the very famous picture of Earthrise taken from the moon. And that was I think in the 60s, when the first 1960s, guys, when the first human being was on the moon. So it's actually, let me say that it's impossible that any human author writing "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth" was thinking about our globe. So when you say, "Look, it is written here in Genesis that God created planet Earth," I would be careful, because I don't think this is what the text wants to say. I know this is what we want the text to say, and I know this is what we hear. But this is not the worldview that the authors of the Bible grew up in. And is it possible that our search for truth, also for truth of creation, of Genesis 1 is misdirected if all we are thinking about is the time and the material processes of the universe's origins? You know, the biblical authors are trying to communicate through their sense of the universe, the meaning and the nature and the purpose of the world, and answer these worldview questions. And that takes a bending of your mind and of our mind to be able to create space for other cultural views of the universe, and to see them as valuable even though they didn't have the Hubble Space Telescope. So what picture of the world did they have? Let's take a look at this. This is a little bit how you could imagine this drawing to be. Let me see if I can point some things out. People in the ancient times, they saw the earth as land, as a plate of land floating around or being in water, surrounded by waters everywhere, above, below, and the earth was resting on pillars, the pillars of the earth. Maybe some of you are Ken Follett fans, and you've heard about that. The primordial ocean was all around. Even below the earth was water, just so we know that. Often it was assumed that there were high mountains on the edge of that disk that held up the sky. The sky was usually thought of as a solid dome. Some thought it was made of sapphire, of lapis lazuli, blue precious stones. After all, it looks blue, and it looks like it's really is a bit of like a roof over the world. The stars were fixed and attached to that firmament, and the clouds and the sun traveled by it. There were also openings or windows, the windows of heaven, the floodgates of heaven, and if they opened, that was a bad thing. So I wouldn't recommend singing "Open the floodgates of heaven." That happened at the time of Noah, and yeah, not good. Really not good. So let the water come through. This cosmos could be thought of as a house or a temple. This is the way even some of the psalmists speak about it. In Psalm 24 verse 2 it says, "He has founded the earth upon the seas and established it upon the rivers." Psalm 104 states that God lays the beams of his chambers on the waters. He sets the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. And also an ancient idea was that God was enthroned above the waters and above the earth, in the highest heavens. This is where he had his true temple and he was seated. Below the earth was an area called Sheol, that was the underworld, the world of the dead. And in the waters were also very scary monsters, and we actually read even about them in Genesis 1. Believe it or not, but we will see if we come to that a little bit later. Now, this is not to say that the Bible teaches such an understanding of the world, but it doesn't reject it explicitly and it doesn't argue against it. Genesis here and elsewhere retains those elements of ancient cosmology that are theologically neutral. That's a clear example of what is called accommodation. You remember when I said in the beginning that God had to limit himself when he used authors? So he used people who wrote down what God was telling them, but they wrote it down with their worldview in mind. That was their shared cultural environment. Like the pictures of the Hubble telescope in our solar system, this is our cultural environment in which we grew up. And it's very unlikely that when God wants to tell you something about the world, that you will not interpret whatever you perceive from him in the light of your already existing worldview. So we will talk about the planets and the stars and the universe and nebulas and galaxies and quasars if you grew up with that. And that would be totally normal. That would be just the vocabulary, the building blocks that you have to communicate something from God. And these were the building blocks that people had in the ancient times. Now, interestingly is that this still, the accommodation, we use that also today. I mean, we talk about that the sun was rising, even though we know the sun is not rising. We know that it's the earth that moves around its own axis and not the sun, but it appears like the sun is moving. We talk about the ends of the earth and its four corners. We call about rising up the ladder or going down, and it is a value statement. Up is good and down is bad, even though we know there is no up and down. People in Australia don't fall off the planet. Kind of down would be more in the middle. So this is a little bit, this is also the language of the authors. They talk about the moon. It's called a light in the Bible, even though we know the moon is not a light. It only reflects the light of the sun. It doesn't actually give light. But people conceived of the cosmos in a certain way, and the Bible does not try to correct their science. And maybe that is very uncomfortable for us, especially if you think if the Bible wants to make a true statement, it needs to correct scientifically wrong things, and it doesn't do that. It doesn't accept it either. It's just, remember, it's a shared cultural environment. Now, interestingly, this worldview still exists in the New Testament. In Matthew 4 verse 8, you read the story of the devil taking Jesus on a high mountain from which he can see all the kingdoms of the earth. And that's an assumed cosmology, that there's a point, if you're high up enough, where you can see the whole earth. Jesus talks in Matthew 11 about Capernaum not being exalted to heaven, but going down to Sheol and Hades. In Philippians 2, Paul talks about that Jesus was raised so high that every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Previously in the hymn, we find the descent to human earth and the grave, and then the uplifting again. So it's a clear, many-tiered cosmology that they have In Ephesians it says that we are seated with Christ in the heavenly places. Paul talks about a guy he knew himself who had a vision, an apocalypse, where he ended up ascending to the third heaven. Wait, what? The third heaven? So the first heaven is kind of this sky, and the second heaven is maybe the waters above, and then he was up here in the third heaven, you know? I mean, but we know that doesn't exist. And now you see where we have problems, especially if we want to have a literalist reading of this. So let's look at some of these elements and draw some conclusions. So the Bible talks about the earth, and the better translation would be probably just land, you know, and we are humans, we are made from the earth, we are earthlings, and that doesn't mean planet, but dirtlings, maybe it's a better word. It says in Psalm 102, God looked down from his holy height from earth, he gazed upon the land or the earth. The Hebrew word is eretz, and it means land. Or famous song, as high as the heavens are above the land, above the eretz, so great is his loving kindness towards those who fear him. Then we have the Rakia. Rakia is the Hebrew word for the expanse or the firmament. I think it's sometimes space in the New Living Translation. And we read that God said, let there be a Rakia in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the Rakia and separated the waters which were below the firmament or expanse from the waters which were above them. And it was so. And God called the Rakia heavens. And there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Now, what is this? This is something... Oh, and we see that birds fly against it. So this firmament creates a space in between the waters. So there's always water, and now we have a room in between where there's air, where later birds can fly, and they might bump against this thing, because this Rakia is something very, very solid. Later, Ezekiel, he talks about the Rakia. He has this vision where he's in the throne room. You remember that God is seated on top of the waters above the Rakia. And Ezekiel looks from below and he says there was something like a Rakia over the heads of the living creatures, like the appearance of eyes stretched out over their heads above. And above the Rakia that was over their heads was something like blue sapphire, the appearance of a throne. So he looks through this. Moses has a similar experience in Exodus when he goes and meets with God, when he gets the Ten Commandments and later. And he goes with the elders on the mountain. They have kind of a feast or a communion there, and Moses alone goes on. And you see there's thunder and lightning and God's pyrotechnics. And then Moses says he looked through a blue glass thing. He looked through that. He was on top of this high mountain and he looked through this blue glass, and then he saw the throne of God. And so what Moses is describing is that he is looking through this Rakia, through this firmament, because that was his worldview and his cultural environment. And again, I can feel how some of you get very, very uncomfortable and say, but there is no Rakia. You know, I mean, we know our pictures, we know our environment, but the Bible describes it. The Bible describes how Moses was there and saw through it. So we need to make a decision what we do with this. And how do we read the text? And how do we understand the text? Okay, I leave it there. I don't want to talk about Moses, but I want to talk about the worldview here. So God creates this Rakia. It looks something like this. So we have birds below that fly, and above it we have water. Now there's important theological claim made when we read about it. Oh, first of all, the word Rakia, it's also a verb. It appears later on, and it talks about something that has been hammered, something solid. So it's not a space shield or something. You know, the priests made they rakiaed some things that they laid upon the altar. You can see some of these verses, but I don't want to go into it. What's important for me is this: when we look at the waters and they are threatening, we see that later in Genesis 6, when the flood opens and the Lord opens the floodgates of heaven, then the whole cosmos and the whole earth collapse again. So what we see there is actually in Moses is a decreation. It's an And with Noah, it's an uncreation. God reverses what he has done before. Here in Genesis 1, we see how God establishes the earth, and there we see how he brings it back to the beginning state, where there's water everywhere. And we read it in Genesis 7 that the windows of the skies, or the windows of heaven, or of the Rakia, were opened. Now, what do we learn from that? Oh, sorry. This is a bit tough. Some people say, well, that only happened at Noah's time, and after that we had a different cosmos. But we read in Psalm 104, they still have the same state, where it says he lays the beams of his upper chambers in the water. So we cannot easily make a cosmology where we say, oh, there was the flood and then things changed and they were not like before. The Bible actually consistently uses this worldview all throughout. The theological claim that is made is that the world is actually a place where life can flourish, but it's a dangerous place. And the only thing that's keeping this whole thing from collapsing is something or someone beyond it. If God wouldn't constantly uphold this Rakia, if God wouldn't keep up this solid thing, we would all crash and we would all die. So every breath we breathe, every day we have air in our lungs, or we or anything on the earth, is by grace. It's because God upholds this. Because if he wouldn't, we would die. And I think this is very, very important for us to notice this. Genesis 1 is using an ancient physics in order to give a metaphysical account about the meaning of the universe. The thing is that in our culture we have completely separated that. We have quarantined metaphysics from any conversation about science. So we say this is faith, this is belief area, and this is science, and the two never touch. And you can talk about physical phenomena as if this is all self-explaining and here for no apparent reason. So we talk about quantum physics and all of this, and we can describe it to the detail, and then we look like everything that should be said has been said. And that's not true. You cannot answer questions of metaphysics with physics. Metaphysics have to do with questions of ultimate meaning and purpose. It's like the analogy of a watch. If it just exists, it doesn't give an account of its existence. But that we have a watch asks for the question, why is there a watch and what does it? And explaining the watch would be physics. You could explain, oh, there are little wheels and tiny things and wires and this is how it works. But explaining the purpose of the watch and its meaning, that would be metaphysics. And you can't always infer the reason for something by just describing its parts. You can say, oh, we get better at describing the watch. And now look at it, I can exactly tell you how it works. But you still have not answered why it's there and what it is for. And we grew up in a time where it's assumed when you can exactly explain how it works that you have explained why it's there. And that is not true. And it's very important to remember that. Now, the way you describe how a watch functions, that will change over time as your understanding develops. But that doesn't mean that the metaphysics, why watches were there, is necessarily wrong. Even though we might not use the sun watch now, we might have smart watches or whatever, but the reason why there are watches and what they do is still the same. Even if we would say, oh, that is so primitive, how they try to explain it. But that doesn't mean it is wrong. I hope that makes a bit of sense. Let's look at one more thing and then we take another break. We read that God created light. Let me see if I can put that on here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning one day. Now, what did God create there? What did he make? He made light. But what is light? Again, we come from a very modern worldview, and when we look at this, we might say, well, light, that is photons, that is energy, it's wave, it's particles. So God made this stuff. But then we have a problem, because we know that God only made the sun on day 4. So where did the light come from? What was the light? Now let me ask you, what is the light called? What does God call light? How does he define light? And when we look at it, it says God called the light day. Now, what kind of thing is day? In what category does day belong? And when we think about it, we realize day doesn't belong to the category of matter, it belongs to the category of time. It's a day. Day and night. It's sequence. So what God was creating is not so much about photons and energy and wave and particles, but it's about something else. Because the light comes from God. We see that in different verses, Psalm 36:9, Isaiah 60, and so on. We can look at them in a minute. But what God was creating in the beginning was days, was time, day 1. Light is not a thing that is brought into existence at a specific moment in time, but the order of time is named and is brought into meaningful and functional existence. And remember that in pre-electricity time, the night was not the time for humans to do anything. It was literally, you couldn't do anything. So light was the first thing that was necessary for life to exist. Light and life were almost the same. Now in the morning, do you always see the sun when the sky lights up? Probably not. So where does the light come from? The arrival of light is not always simultaneously with the arrival of the sun. And we have the same sequence in Genesis 1. The light appears before the sun appears. And light emanates from God himself. And there's a number of Psalms, I will not read them all, but Psalm 36, it says, "For with you is the fountain of life, and in your light we see the light." We have another verse in John, when John talks about Jesus, and he says that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And he talks about God. He talks about Jesus. In Isaiah 60, we have a sequence where it talks about that the Lord will be your everlasting light. So it radiates from him. And in Revelation, we have a picture that in the future there will be no more need for the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light. So we have in the beginning of Genesis 1 the order of time, the separation of light and darkness. And we have the separation of the waters, and that is the order of space. Now, I want to end this with a quote. The early chapters of Genesis accurately present accounts of cosmic and human origins in the language and conceptual categories of the ancient Israelite authors of the Bible. These texts should not be removed from their ancient context and read as if they describe cosmic or human origins in the 21st century in scientific terms. They speak in terms of an ancient Near Eastern perception of the world and should be interpreted within that setting. When we discern the meaning of the texts in their ancient context, we find that they constitute a worldview statement about God and his relationship to the world, and about humans and their relation to God and the world. And this basic statement transcends all ancient cultural settings and commands the attention of God's people in all places and all times. So we learn the world is a dangerous place. It's only upheld because God sustains it. We learn that God himself is the light of life, but that God also orders time and God orders space. And I will talk a little bit more about the relationship between light and darkness. Just when you look at Genesis 1 on its own terms, it gives you the plot line of the whole story of the Bible, even ending with God and humans ruling together in the seventh day that has no end and no rest. But we come to that later. A last thought. How did the story start? With darkness. And then came light. And this is also the order how all the endings of the days are described. There was evening and there was morning, day one. We start in darkness, we come to the light.